Welcome everyone to this session on reflections on COP27. Today we're going to be talking about the recent COP27 that took place in Egypt, and for that we have a series of academics and students from the university that have participated in different capacities on COP27. So what we're going to do is that I'm going to leave the floor for each one of them to introduce themselves so they can tell you a little bit about themselves. And after that, we will give them 5 minutes each to tell you about how was the experience this year. The first one that I have on my list is Professor David Boslem.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yep, I'm David Burslem. I'm the Interdisciplinary Director for Environment and Biodiversity, and I'm also a Professor of Ecology in the School of Biological Sciences. So that's my background, and this year was the first COP I have attended.
I'll pass it on to Professor Fries.
Yeah, thank you, Anna, and welcome everyone for joining this session. I'm Frans de Vries. I'm an environmental and resource economist, and I'm based in the business school of the University of Aberdeen. And I've been working on IEAs or international environmental agreements to some degree in my work. And like David, this was also the first time that I actually actively, or not actively, but as an observer, participated in a COP. So more on that, on my experiences shortly. So thanks.
I'll hand it over to Eloise Mayol.
Hello, so I'm Eloise Mayol. I joined COP27 more in an activist capacity. I'm part of an organisation called the UK Youth Climate Coalition. This was the first COP which I attended within the Blue Zone, but I've been to Glasgow COP doing more civil society action there. So yeah, more about that later.
We have two more people that will be joining us, but we're having a couple of problems with some of the technical stuff. So I'll briefly introduce them, and then once we manage to get them on the call, they will introduce themselves. One is Adam Lambert, who is the Vice President for Activities and at the Aberdeen University Students Association. And the other one is Dee Sidhu, who is a PhD candidate at the School of Biological Sciences, and both of them attended COP this year. A little bit of context of why I am here and why I'm sharing this. I was the head of the delegation for the Aberdeen University last year in COP26, and with no more delay, what I'll do is that I'll hand it over to Professor David Boslem for him to tell us a little bit of his reflections on how his visit to COP went.
Thank you very much, Anna. So perhaps just a little bit of background on what the COP is, I think probably for the benefit of people who may not be familiar with that. So this is a convention which it happens under the United Nations Climate Change Convention. The Conference of the Parties, the COP, happens every year, and of course we all remember the COP26 in Glasgow, which was a huge event for us because it happened locally, of course. So this year the COP was in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And the first COP to have taken place in Africa, so it was sort of billed as the African COP, and that was very apparent in terms of the representation at the meeting. So I was there in the first week. We divided the delegation. There were 5 of us there in total, as Anna has said, and 3 of us were there in the first week, and 2 in the second. So I went in the first week. I arrived in the weekend just before the actual formal meeting started, and even from before the formal negotiations were taking place, it was very apparent that discussions were going on behind the scenes. I was aware from the sort of atmosphere of the meeting that there was a lot of discussion around the agenda and the sort of loss and damage question that was very much at the top of the of discussion. So loss and damage refers to the finance associated with countries that are being affected by climate change already, and the costs that they're incurring from climate events like floods and droughts. And there has been a long-standing movement to try and get loss and damage onto the agenda of COPs. And finally, this happened, and the emergence of that as an agenda item was sort of the weekend's big discussion point. And that became very apparent to me. I attended a side event in the Blue Zone that was chaired by Nicola Sturgeon. It was a fairly small gathering, but the sort of the main highlight of that meeting was a very provocative speech by the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, who was actually famous from her interventions in Glasgow as well, when she kind of left with the rhetorical statements, you know, when will leaders lead? That may be familiar to some of you. And she was equally provocative this time, and it was probably her leadership of the issue around her leadership of the developing country agenda that got this onto the discussions at this COP, and ultimately to a conclusion at the end, which we can perhaps come back to. Given my background, I was very interested in topics relating to forests and nature-based solutions at COP, and there was no shortage of things to attend. The Blue Zone, which is where all the country pavilions were, was absolutely rife with discussions around forests because of their important role in climate change mitigation, obviously, and loss of forests contributing to emissions. And in fact, it was a promise around forests that was the first announcement from COP on day one. You may remember, or you may have heard Rishi Sunak announcing the creation of the Forest Climate Leaders Partnership, which is a voluntary association of 26 countries which have come together to make commitments around financing of forest protection. Away from the kind of leaders, the big debates on forests was really around the role of forests and bioenergy as a green power solution. There were several of the large countries with big forest areas that were making very prominent commitments towards expanding forests for bioenergy. I went to one particular meeting in the Indonesia pavilion where it was very corporate dominated. Lots of the big commercial tree planters were there, promising expansion of forests for bioenergy, and some very provocative interventions from the audience around the risks to planting forests on peatlands. So there's a big area of peatlands in Indonesia which have been rather insensitively managed in the past, and there's an estimate of 80 billion tons of carbon stored in Indonesian peat forests. So that was one issue, the risks of expanding tree cover for industrial tree plantations. Another one, of course, being a big issue around land, because expansion of forests for tree planting takes land away from other things. That could be for food production, for instance, or for and also the risk of forest clearance for associated with biodiversity loss. So that was again another very provocative point that ultimately will have impacts in the future. So returning to the Forests and Climate Leaders Partnership, there were big announcements around funding again for that. So you may remember a similar kind of announcement about forests after the Glasgow event, which was a pledge signed by 145 different countries. So this appeared to be a little more modest, but nonetheless covered countries representing about 2/3 of all global forest cover. So even though it's a small collection of countries, it did represent a big area. The leadership is coming from the United States and Ghana, who are chairing that. And there's some attempt at filling the big funding gaps that exist for forest protection. So last year there was an estimate that $12 billion were needed to fulfill the commitments of the Glasgow Pledge, and so far about $2.5 billion of that has been spent, and not much else committed. So Germany came forwards with a big commitment, but beyond that there wasn't a great deal else. The UK committed $150 million, which
thank you,
okay,
David.
thank you, Anna.
Yeah.
Pass over to others.
I'll pass it over now to Professor Franz Bryce.
Great, thank you, Anna. Thanks, David, for sharing your thoughts on this. So for the others, I was with David there as well the first week, and we had some kind of chats while we were there and sharing some thoughts on, given that we were also coming from different disciplines, right? So David in the biological sciences predominantly, and I'm an economist in the business school and approaching COP probably with kind of different eyes in that respect. And as I mentioned in the introduction, so I'm an environmental economist by training. Sorry, can you still hear me? I got some kind of phone call coming in, so apologies for that.
Yes, we do. We still hear you. Thank you.
Apologies for that. So, as an environmental economist, I have a kind of keen interest in the design and functioning of environmental markets and incentive-based policy mechanisms for pollution control. So I think it is primarily with that kind of set of eyes, if you will, that I kind of went into this COP and really interested in finding out how these negotiations and discussions actually are happening on the ground, where it really matters, on making commitments with respect to reducing carbon dioxide emissions. Relatedly, I'm also interested on the interplay between environmental policy and technological innovation. So in these realms, kind of mitigating the impact of climate change by trying to reduce emissions, say, cost effectively. I was interested in these COPs and how, say, international environmental agreements more generally shape, say, environmental market conditions, and as well kind of induce incentives for innovation and diffusion of abatement technologies that kind of that countries can take up. But as an economist by training, and given what I know about international environmental agreements, say COPs, I was a bit skeptical about whether COP27 would boost the global efforts in committing to reduce carbon emissions aggressively, as we basically need, right, in order to kind of keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius target in sight. And if you look at the emissions that are currently going on in terms of carbon generation, emissions are still rising. Given that past COPs, past negotiations have made some commitments on reducing carbon dioxide emissions, one way or another, countries cannot, are for whatever reason, are not able to kind of pursue that kind of trajectory that we need in reducing the carbon emissions, I think, aggressively. And effectively, how I look at it as a kind of economist, it's a lot of free riding going on between or across nations. But for me, it was also interesting, David already kind of flagged this up, is kind of loss and damage component that was pretty prominent in the first week. And kind of relatedly on how we finance this whole change in driving down carbon emissions. So I think as an economist, how I kind of looked at this is like there's kind of two different but interrelated discussions going on. The first is really about equity and fairness, right? The loss and damage is how do we compensate countries for who are incurring a huge amount of damages and costs from climate change generated by, say, Western societies, US, China, and Western Europe effectively. To me, that sounds like more like an equity, fairness-based discussion. On the other hand, it's like, which is a kind of adaptation problem, On the other hand, it's like we also need to kind of mitigate climate change right now. Say that keeping the 1.5 degrees Celsius in our eyes, in vision, which means kind of really driving down emissions aggressively in say the short term. And that is some kind of balance that I was hoping to kind of to get some insight into how this actually plays out on the ground in this COP. So to me, it looked like how to reconcile this kind of tension between these two things, like adaptation versus mitigation. And you actually saw some differences on how countries approach this, right? Scotland was one of the few countries, I think, with Denmark and a few others, who were kind of really promoting this kind of loss and damage approach. But if you were listening to the U.S. envoy of the U.S. is really opposed to that. They say it's kind of crowding out funds, right? And this comes back to the innovation or the financing of what it is that we're doing. We should focus more on mitigation. So while at COP this first week, there's a lot of discussions going on surrounding these two kind of issues, adaptations versus mitigation. And personally, I'm struggling to see how all these discussions will kind of approach climate change from different angles. David mentioned already forestry as kind of one aspect that we could utilize. But there's so many other aspects of climate change that we can utilize in order to kind of mitigate and adapt to the kind of problems that we're facing.
Thank you.
So given this array of issues, how this actually drives down emissions for me is still a big issue.
Thank you very much. I see that we have all of our panel members have been able to join. So I would like to welcome both Dee and Adam. Just a quick reminder that for those of you participating in the call, you can submit your questions through the Q&A tab, and we will try to pick as many as we can in the discussion part of the panel. So feel free to submit your questions, and we'll go through them after each one of the participants have shown us their reflections. So I'm going to hand it over now to Adam, who is the Vice President for Activities. And Adam, you have the floor for 5 minutes to tell us about how was your experience at COP. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Apologies, there were some technical difficulties as mentioned. So I will just start with a really quick introduction, if that's okay. So I know that Anna did a wee brief introduction, but I thought I'll explain more about who I am. So I'm Adam Lambert. I'm the VP for Activities. I'm one of the elected student officers. So as my role, I look after all the societies and sports clubs and student groups in the student union. And as the uni post had mentioned about the uni post about all these environmental experts attending COP, I am not by any means an environmental expert, so I'd just like to clarify that to start off with. And my details of answers to the questions may not be nearly as in depth to what my fellow panel members would be, but yeah. So for the COP itself, quite honestly, I wasn't sure what to expect. Again, as me not being an expert in the sustainability sector, I wasn't sure what to expect from it. And it being my first COP that I've attended as well, wasn't sure what it was. And to be honest with you, then looking at like sort of the schedule for events and stuff, it's very overwhelming with the amount of different events you can attend. Which I felt was difficult to sort of like choose which area I wanted to attend firstly. But upon like being there and attending like a different couple of sessions or side events rather, I did actually tend to take a massive interest to active mobility and public transport. So I attended a lot of meetings and side events around that. Where we discussed, about like infrastructure and what can be done in cities and smaller towns and areas around public transport and active mobility. And I was also involved in some discussions then with universities as well, where we had talked about what universities are doing as part of their network and their contribution to the global effort as well. And we talked a little bit about like divestment of fossil fuels as well, which I know is like quite an important thing, especially with the university ourselves, with our agreement with divestment of fossil fuels, which was signed a year or 2 years back, I think. But yeah, I think I'll just keep it nice and brief. I'll not run into the 5 minutes.
No, that's perfect, Adam. Thanks a lot. I'll hand it over now to Dee Sidhu. Welcome.
Hi there again, sorry for the slight technical issues. Yeah, so to start with the introduction first, my name is Karandeep Sidhu, but I normally go by Dee, and I'm a University of Aberdeen PhD candidate in the School of Biological Sciences, and what I mostly research is how species adapt to climate change. So I was with Adam in the second week of COP, and my focus was very much on the biodiversity aspects of climate change. So a lot of the talks that I went to were nature-based solutions, biodiversity, and climate change, and how these kind of things interact. But what that actually meant is, in practice, a lot of the conversations that I was listening to, a lot of the people I was interacting with were either from Indigenous communities and local populations, as a lot of biodiversity hotspots are in areas where there's also Indigenous communities and local populations. So there was a lot of really intricate conversations about not only things like nature-based solutions, but how do we do them equitably with practices that affect the people who already live in those areas, and how do we make sure that we're preserving biodiversity in a way that is not just paternalistic, that is giving agency to the people who are already in those areas and the people who are already both managing those areas and also have things like land rights that might be able to sell them off, or things like forestry. What is those types of interactions, and what is the most sensitive and sensible way to do that? And the reason there was this focus for me on biodiversity is because biodiversity is used for things like carbon capture. It's to make sure that we're not increasing emissions, but also not to make sure that we're not increasing emissions, but also to see how we can do things like planting trees and land restoration and sea restorations to improve the carbon in the atmosphere, and how that's done in a biologically relevant way. Because the thing that I was quite shocked about was the lack of understanding, or like real nuance of understanding, of how biodiversity and climate change do interact. And a lot of my conversations were, how do they interact? Can this be done equitably? Isn't it just science? Why is there a societal element? So there was a lot of these conversations that I was a part of.
Thank you, Dee. I'll hand the floor over now to Eloise Mayal.
So I didn't go to COP technically with the university. I have recently joined the university as a first year PhD candidate, but all the planning behind COP was way up before I joined here. So yeah, a bit of context. The activism group I'm part of, the UK Youth Climate Coalition, is a climate justice and youth group. So all of us are volunteers aged between 18 and 29. And the organisation is approaching 15 years old, which is quite unique for a youth group to be as old as that. And I think has attended at least the past 12 COPs, because its original formation was a few young people recognising that there wasn't enough youth engagement at COP, which we think is a very important thing, considering these decisions will disproportionately affect younger generations rather than older generations. And I think that's really important, particularly, as David said, at an African COP, which, as Africa has such a young population, really ensuring that there's this emphasis on understanding the repercussions of the decisions made now will affect these much younger generations considerably more. And so we went mostly to focus on loss and damage. Actually, was our main main focus, that, and making sure there was more youth engagement as possible. We were campaigning to have loss and damage on the agenda back in Bonn in Germany in summer, which is the conference that happens for the subsidiary bodies for every COP, and that's kind of where nitty-gritty happens in terms of decision making, but it hasn't got quite a lot of fanfare, so it's often overlooked. So we were kind of being very loud about it then, and then we were very excited to hear that it was agreed to be on the agenda just before COP even started. And so that was sort of, sparked a bit of hope that this conversation might go somewhere, that it was suddenly quite last minute agreed to be included. And I suppose the way activism and civil society participation happening at this COP was very different to COP26. So we were also at COP26 and we had like an inside team and an outside team. The inside team was in the blue zone. I was part of the outside team, which was hosting civil society actions, spaces. We booked out the entirety of Glasgow University to Student Union, so that youth people coming into the space could have a place to organise and have free Wi-Fi and food and place to store equipment and have their own workshops, because we know that youth are quite consistently quite resource poor in these settings. And that was fine in Glasgow, but of course it's very different in Egypt. And we were really uncertain going in, how would civil society presence be known, considering there was a lot of effort to dissuade civil society action happening there, and particularly issues of those even African NGO groups, small NGO groups, trying to gain access to it. A lot of us were being priced out. Our accommodation was raised by £2,000 like, just spontaneously, because the owner realised he could get more money out of it. And I think we were like pushed around in all the WhatsApp groups. We had young people being like, I'm homeless now, please someone help me. And so it was very tricky, just even financially, for us volunteers to go, because of how volatile the situation was. And we didn't think there was much support from the Egyptian government in creating the space for civil society presence to be there. Within the actual COP, it was okay. It wasn't too bad. UN rules are very, very strict, but very consistent. And so we were able to host our own actions, and that's what we did. We hosted actions highlighting loss and damage, and that we think that the Global North should contribute to it much more than they're doing now and stop delaying. I was in week 1, so much of the Global North still wasn't agreeing to the idea of a loss and damage fund underneath the UNFCCC. A lot of the money at the moment is more interested in going into things like the Global Shield, which is an insurance-based system outside of the UNFCCC, which isn't quite as accessible for those who are very vulnerable to the impacts of climate crisis, and isn't very good at dealing with both, well, non-economic elements of loss and damage as well. So we want that. And so we're pushing for that, and we're also meeting with members from the civil service to kind of push for more youth engagement in those spaces. So we met with the UK Youth Coordinator, and the week 2 team met with the lead negotiator, Archie Young, who has now just stepped down, just because he has, no other reason, but we just met with him, and also Alex Sharma and other kind of high up people within the organising space, because both as us as UKYCC, but also as our constituency, which is Youngo, which all youth groups in the space automatically come under, really wanted to ensure there was more youth inclusion in these decisions, and highlighting the issues that youth are having trying to engage in this space. There were a few successes in terms of the youth side of things. We had our first Children and Youth Pavilion. So those who don't know, you have the actual negotiations happening, and then you have side events, and then you also have pavilions. And pavilions are sort of a space where either a country or an organisation kind of hold and host their own events. And that was the first time we had a Children and Youth one, so it was wonderful to have that kind of more formal recognition and actual space for us to be there, because usually we're kind of attached to other things or on the outskirts of what's going on. And I think we had the first youth envoy underneath the presidency as well. So again, recognising that you should be a significant and very visible part of the process. So those were good things that came out of it. And we hope that kind of continues and improves over time. And there was also a lot of reflection on our role as youth, particularly like Global North youth acting in this space. When you apply for badges, we kind of slightly over apply, you never get as many as you want. And we gave some of our badges away to other Global South youth groups who are struggling to get in, to increase that visibility of Global South youth in that, because we felt that that was a very valuable way we could support as an organisation which has quite a lot of practice in that space. We also did a lot of trying to help and train other maybe newer youth activists, or those who have less access to resources or experience, on how to host their own actions, what they can and can't do, and also realising that us as maybe British youth in this space are slightly more vulnerable than some Global South people as well, because there were some issues of Global South youth being more harshly targeted in Glasgow, and we didn't want any repeats of that. So unfortunately, I didn't get to go to any side events because I was busy doing all these other things, and I would have loved to, but didn't have the time for it. We also did quite a lot of interviews with different media outlets. We had, I think, BBC, Radio 5, and then I ended up on the news in Benin and in Germany as they were filming our actions as well. And so that was interesting because I hadn't done a lot of that yet. But it was also interesting, particularly the BBC's asking about what's COP like. And it wasn't me talking, it was one of my colleagues, and we prepped all together. And sometimes the condensation that happens when you get labelled a youth activist, and also also in this interview, they kind of kept pushing towards personal action. So they asked about what COP is, how's it going, but they kept drawing it towards personal action, which I think is a little bit frustrating because they're two very different levels. And I think it kind of highlights to us how maybe misunderstood COP27 still is, or the COP process, and kind of what it can achieve and can't achieve. So I'd like to see more discussions like this around what COP is like, what its limitation, what it can do, what we can more reasonably push for, so that there is more civil society presence, not just during the COP weeks, but throughout the years leading up to next one. So there is more pressure within the space for negotiators to act with more urgency.
So that's brilliant. Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions for the panel, and I won't directly direct them to any of you, but if any of you want to pick it up, please go for it. I think that we have quite a diverse audience, and I think it might be good to step a little bit aside from the topics that were covered at COP that you have very well summarized and you have told us about. I think it would be interesting if one of you told us, how is one day at COP? What does it mean to go to COP?
I could volunteer a very quick answer if that's okay. I think for me, I think it was a highly eye-opening. There were some discussions that I was involved in that was around the loss and damage, and I think that you see how passionate people are talking about the experiences that's happening in their own countries, and I think that you see the passion, and it's quite eye-opening. I think that you're there and you're the effect that this is actually having on places, and we're not seeing it enough here it's crazy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of in practice, what happens? So you go in the morning, what does it look like? What is in practice going to COP? Because most people haven't had the chance to go, and what it is like in practice.
Shall I?
Yeah.
Sorry, Adam. No, you go ahead.
No, I was going to say for myself anyway. So once I got my eye in for the specific side events I wanted to attend, the day itself is sort of turning up. You turn up to the venue itself, which was quite a large international center. It was massive. But once you're there, you're just into an open space straight away, where there's so many different side event rooms there. As soon as you walk out into the open space, where you're able to attend all the different events that's going on. But there's also then pavilions going around as well indoors, where there's all the different countries that attend the COP are able to show and demonstrate what they're doing in the country themselves to promote the sustainability within the country, which is kind of cool as well to sort of see all the different things that everywhere's trying to do. But I'm sure David will give a better answer than myself, but yeah.
Not at all, actually, a very similar one answer. Anna, if I can just elaborate briefly. So as Adam said, day one for a novice like me, the word is overwhelming. There's just hundreds of things going on simultaneously, and you very quickly realize that you have to be quite focused. So for me, it was in the early stages and even beforehand, trying to find out about what exactly was going on in the areas I was interested in, and then following an agenda and keeping quite strictly to that if you can. So all of the pavilions that have been mentioned, they will publish their programs of events. And so I was trying to look through those programs, working out what I was interested in. But of course, when you're in these events, you meet people, you're constantly talking to people. It's like an academic conference, but actually, 10 times that in the sense that you're constantly meeting people, and those conversations lead to new things, lead to you going to things you hadn't already planned to go to because they've been suggested to you, and lots and lots of contact making. And then, as Eloise mentioned, there's an awful lot of media presence there, so there's quite a lot of requests come in for interviews and short clips, just if you have a particular expertise in any area. So yeah, overwhelming initially, but you sort of get a handle on how to manage that eventually.
So Dee and Eloise, you were talking about how on the top of being overwhelming, there was some parts of society that maybe are misrepresented when making those decisions, and this relates to indigenous communities and maybe youth, and how they are represented in what is going to be the decision of how their lives are going to happen in the future. I am curious to learn whether you come from COP hopeful or not, and whether you see how those of us that maybe don't belong to any of those communities can facilitate those things happening, or we can support that happening more.
I can go first, then Louise, you can go second, because you'll probably have something slightly different to say. So in terms of like the underrepresentation or misrepresentation, the thing that was a bit disheartening was that there were many side events, which are kind of like panel talks like this that are happening, overlapping all the time, and they've only got a capacity of like 100 to 300 people, and there's about like, I think there's like 11,000 people in COP overall. So you'd think that those rooms would be quite packed, but in reality they were half capacity. And the ones when I would go to a lot of the speakers where there was Indigenous speakers or people from local communities, there was maybe me and 10 other people in the room. So first, it's great that they have this platform in theory, but in reality people aren't listening. That's not where people who are decision makers in those spaces, who have influence, that's not where they're choosing to go, and it's not where they're choosing to spend their time to listen to these people. So firstly, there's that. Secondly, when I would go to the more like scientific or ecologist-based talks of nature-based solutions, there was a lot of this talk about how to give agency or engage within local communities and local populations, while preserving biodiversity to ultimately benefit climate change, or benefit the fight against climate change. And when I would then go to talks where there was more Indigenous speakers and local communities, there was a lot of there was two sort of strands of conversation, and I'm essentializing a lot here, but generally two strands of conversation. And one was about land rights, that Indigenous communities or populations didn't have land rights, so they can't protect the land because it's not theirs to protect. If they try and do any intervention, if they try and interact with it a certain way, they have no right, they have no power, and that is sort of taken away from them, sold off by governments or other organisations. And the second one was that this idea of nature-based solutions was very difficult for some communities, because nature-based solutions we've spoken about a lot, but it's a big essentialization, and David can step in if I'm like completely going the wrong way. But it's basically just a solution where, rather than invoking technology to deal with a biodiversity problem, what you do is you try and use nature, whether like planting trees as a nature-based solution, or mangroves to stop coastal erosion. These are all types of nature-based solutions where you use what is already available with low technology solutions to kind of help restore or preserve or whatever the goal is. And there was a lot of difficulty with this, because it felt to some Indigenous communities that this idea of nature-based solutions is one that these Indigenous communities have had for generations, and it's previously been ignored by the scientific community and historically been stopped. Historically, this knowledge has been rooted out. So to come back sort of full circle now and say, oh, here's some nature-based solutions that we think as scientists you should in academia should implement, comes across very patronizing to them, when they're like, we know that we've been in the land longer, for generations, we understand the ecology of the land better, we have our own ideas of nature-based solutions, and they kind of feel locked out of these conversations. And so I think there's this, on a bright side, there's a possibility for collaboration there. There's a possibility for collaboration, but there's also a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of nuance that needs to be taken, and there's vast difference in opinion between Indigenous communities. So I think a big thing for me was this idea of like one-fit-all solution that we sort of tend to go maybe a little bit towards is actually unhelpful, and what it actually does is lock communities that have knowledge, have something important to say, and it is their land, and they should be the space should be open to them, and we should be treating it as a collaboration instead of this kind of we're going there and doing something. So there's an opportunity for that.
That's super interesting. Thank you. And Eloise?
So the topic of hope is always really interesting in conversations about COP or climate, and some people have very strong opinions that they shouldn't feel hope, or some people say you should feel hope, but then you're being naively optimistic. And so outside of the ecology I do and climate activism, I also research climate anxiety, which is another random thing I tend to do. And one of my collaborators in that, she has this idea of kind of radical hope, which is this idea of being hopeful persistently because you have no other choice but to be. And I think in the youth activism space, we go in and agree with Deepa saying it's often very disheartening to see the amount of distraction often at COPs. It's a huge overwhelming event. There's so much going on. We wanted to go, the actual negotiations, which as observers, the reasons we were originally there was to be able to watch these negotiations as a kind of transparency mechanism. And so that's happening, but then also you have the side events, and I agree, like there's a lot going on. These rooms are really big. We hosted our own as well. And similarly, attention is spread in so many different directions during a COP that I feel like the people that should be heard the most are often drowned out by the people who have platforms everywhere that aren't missing opportunities to get their voices heard. And in this moment, this international moments where you do have Indigenous communities coming in, and those from the global south or those from low-lying islands coming in trying to make their case, the attention should be on them. And there are so many other things, particularly pavilions, there's hundreds of pavilions, and they're all doing about 100 things a day. That's, as someone in the space, as an activist who's trying to get a certain message across, that's really frustrating because it's hard to grab attention. And there are different ways to grab attention. We did actions along our own side events and also negotiated many different ways of doing it. But in our actions, either the ones we're attending or the ones that we're supporting, if we put the effort into organising, there's a lot of forms to fill out, a lot of decisions to make sure that everyone's okay with it happening. We use those very loud attention-gathering spaces and offered talking roles within them to give them straight away to those in the global south or those who might not be heard. And when you have a megaphone shouting like a big square of people going by, okay, at least they're being heard at this moment, and tend to grab a lot of media attention, and so then they can have their voices heard, and we push them into the interviews. Or those who are nervous, we're like, listen, we've got your back, we can tell you things you can say. If they're being a bit nervous, and we're like, we've got your back. And I think as global north youth who maybe have just had the privilege of being a bit more experienced and the time to figure out these different strategies, it was our role to be the ones putting the effort and energy into creating space for these people to be heard. And within the youth movement, there is a lot of hope because we have to be. Like, this isn't really a choice. We're sort of deciding or fighting to decide what world we get to grow in, and for people in the global south, that's happening right now. It's not a future conversation. And so I haven't really got a way of like putting this together nicely, but there is a frustration and a hopefulness constantly kind of going to and fro in these spaces, and I feel very energized being with all these people and learning from them all. And there's a lot of energy in the youth space, but at the same time, we're constantly swimming upstream to be recognized as legitimate or heard, or to be acknowledged as a demographic should be, and probably one of the biggest stakeholders in these conversations.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to hear you guys talk about how it has gone this year and the feelings that you have when you have come back, because I do remember having from a completely different perspective that you might have, Eloise, obviously, but feeling that tension between I am hopeful, but I really don't know what is getting out of here, and if really the things that are needed to be negotiated are actually happen at the pace and the speed that we need them to happen. And regarding that, I have a question for you, Professor De Vries, and because you are an expert in environmental business, and I want to hear from your perspective. Do you think that since the landscape is so complex and we have so many people and so many parties that are involved in these decisions, could these negotiations go faster, or it is because of the complexity of the business and law and everything that is required to make those decisions? Are they delaying it in purpose, or is it actually that hard?
Thanks, Anna. I think it's a great question. So first of all, I think my experience kind of echoes my colleagues as well who went there. It's overwhelming, and I think I mentioned this to you, David, when we were there. It's like you have to be so selective in terms of what you want to go to because it's overwhelming. So for me, my experience was like I felt a bit kind of lost in the sense that all these discussions, it's all fragmented. They all kind of approach climate change from different angles, whether this is kind of more from a justice-based approach or kind of nature-based solutions or forestry. Effectively, it's all about driving carbon emissions down, right? It's we have a fossil fuel-based driven economy worldwide, effectively still, and we need to kind of transition away from that. So at the heart, coming back to your question, Anna, is like it shouldn't be too hard, right? Because it's just reducing carbon. There's different ways on how you can go about attacking that. Essentially, I think that's one of the complexity because carbon is driven by so many different issues. From an economics perspective, climate change is a global public bad or a global public good, depending on how you look at it. It requires all nations to come together and commit to kind of reducing climate change, these kind of carbon emissions. How that translates into domestic climate policies across different nations is another issue. One insight, which was a bit of an eye-opener, but it's not surprising in the end. So I spoke to one who was at previous COPs and also was at Paris. What also changes, which is not a constant, is that nations' preferences change over time. So while in Paris, some blocs or certain countries committed to kind of approaching and reducing carbon dioxide emissions, at some point, certain countries don't even talk to other countries anymore because they change their attitude towards, say, debt relief, as an example, right? Which is now coming up again in these discussions, which makes it also kind of complicating factor in kind of future negotiations. So again, preferences change in terms of how countries look at this and who is incurring the damages from climate change, right? And whether you weigh adaptation stronger than mitigation. As I already mentioned, how the US approaches this, they are fundamentally opposed to kind of loss and damage because they are arguing that this crowds out funds for mitigation. Imagine this is only the US, who is a big player, of course, in the world economy. Let alone there's numerous other countries who kind of have their preference or kind of approach towards or attitude towards this kind of balancing of equity versus reducing carbon emissions. I have a hard thought kind of seeing how this moves forward. It's and I think as a final remark on your question, it's like as an insider, as inside information that I heard from somebody, it's like it seems that the private sector has a huge amount of stakes in the short term, right? So if you talk about climate finance and how current economies are currently still being run, there's a lot of assets in there which are going to be stranded if we're going to move away from fossil fuel, right? Mm-hmm. It's just how it is. So it makes it more complicated from an economics, i.e., finance type of perspective.
Yeah,
very, very challenging.
There's lots of super interesting questions from the audience. We won't have time to cover all of them, but I'm going to try to pick up some of them. And these ones I'm going to direct to someone. And if I put you on the spot and you don't know the answer, that's fine. Just pass it along. But I would ask you to try to be brief, because that way we might be able to cover a few more than if we extend ourselves. And the first one is for Adam. And it is, what message from COP would you give to staff and students about what we need to do in the university and or in the role we play in the northeast of Scotland?
Yeah, so for myself, as I had mentioned at the start, I sort of like attended these year side events around like active mobility and public transport and stuff like that there. And I don't know if anyone knows in Aberdeen now, the city have just got in these here city bikes, which are main part of the city, but are not actually accessible for students at all because they're not like based around the old Aberdeen area where students actually are. So I think that there's a lot of work to do in the Northeast here ourselves, like with the university around bikes, and actually just on that as well with the bikes is that there is a bid in for the student union with Just Transition. We're putting in a bid for 50,000 towards bikes, that there can be bikes on campus, and I think that if we're able to get students and like the actual local community to vote for that there, that we can extend the bike availability across the city. I think it's a massive project that's needed, again, because there was a study done a few years back about actual transport itself and how in the UK over 50% of journeys are 2 miles or less, which is staggering almost. And again, I will have to admit I've been a culprit of it before, but you know, if we're able to improve the availability of public transport or make infrastructure better or access to active mobility better, then I think that's a small step that we can take towards it. Yeah.
That's awesome. For Eloise, do you think that it's possible that instead of adding to the noise of COP, we could use our knowledge to point people through a kind of program towards the conversations and the people that we should be listening, for example, to Indigenous communities' knowledge, or is that too big of a task?
I think it's important that COP isn't the be-all and end-all, and it's not the only tool we have to fight the climate movement or climate crisis. It's definitely a really important one. It gets a lot of media attention, particularly in the first weekends international. And so I think something exciting maybe the university could do is also like using its own sway and gravitas to highlight issues or highlight voices, or if it was to go again, maybe host their own side events or support other people's, either through like capacity and knowledge sharing and being not just observers consuming the information, but also acting and driving forward our own sort of desires and recommendations as a university that's really pushing sustainability, and collaborating with Indigenous groups and stuff like that. Like, it's frustrating that the people who are most affected by climate change are not being heard. And so I see it as the role of Global North people, not just going and taking spaces away from those people, but because just for our own kind of personal benefit or our interest as COP is really interesting, but using the more influence and power that we have to create spaces for them as well. And so I think that would be really exciting if we could do that more. And I think particularly ahead of the one in Dubai, that would be great, because the issues that either youth groups and stuff that we're having and Indigenous groups and all Global South groups, in terms of things like finance and money, like for Glasgow, we did a fundraising campaign to get more money for Global South people to come to the UK because it's expensive, and Dubai is also really expensive. So anything that we can do to be not just observers of this, but active supporters of climate justice and sustainability and urgency would be great. And having lots of voices saying similar things is very valuable. Rather, I don't think it's noise. You need to make noise. It's just making sure that there is sort of collaboration in that noise to make it heard by the people who are making decisions for our future.
Okay, that's awesome. And this one is for Professor De Vries. So, and I don't want you to explain me the model, but just to know whether there is one or not. So there is a question that that is asking in the chat that says, what economic theory is being used or quoted the most at COP to debate the environmental issues? Is there any?
Oh, well, I'm not sure if there's a specific economic theory, right? I think it's like, in the end, it comes down to cost benefit. At the heart, it's a cost benefit type of approach that all countries probably take. Who is incurring the damages from climate change? Who's incurring the cost? What is the benefit of future emissions reductions? At the heart, it's a fundamentally cost benefit approach. It's not really a theory. It's like, but that is how countries typically look at these things from an economics perspective.
Okay. And would you be able to comment on to what extent did you see the private sector involved in the loss and damage this year? Do you have a feeling of that, or even of their presence at COP?
Yeah, the presence was really high. There was a lot of people from the oil and gas industry, and there was a lot of people from like charities and other like public or private sectors as well. There was a big presence of them. They hosted a lot of side events, and from what I can remember, those were the ones that were more well attended as well. So there was a big presence of them.
Okay, so this is going to be the last question. I'm going to hand over to Professor David Burslem, and I would like you, David, to say the goodbyes for everyone, but also to maybe touch on what are the forums or activities that the university is taking forward as outcomes from COP27.
Yes, thank you very much, Anna. So in answer to the question first, the university has recently appointed a Dean for Environmental Sustainability, Professor Tavis Potts. And Tavis, along with Auser and many others, are developing an environmental sustainability strategy for the university, and that includes many things. And the one I want to just highlight is, I'm sure Tavis won't mind me saying this because it's public knowledge, but there will be the development of a climate assembly approach. So that will involve the entire university, anyone who wants to engage with that, just to talk about how we embed the principles of sustainability and talk about climate as an institution, as a community. So that's one of the things the university is doing. It's obviously also has its net zero target, and there's a huge amount of work going on behind the scenes that is designed to help achieve that around the fabric of the university, the way we travel, and many other areas. So that's a big ongoing agenda. So finally, it is 3 o'clock. I just want to thank everybody. First of all, my fellow speakers and panel members, and especially Anna for agreeing to chair it, and for her leadership actually on getting the university observer status at the Climate Change Convention, which was achieved last year for the first time. So thank you, Anna, thank you everyone else, and thank you all for attending and challenging us with these very interesting questions. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.